Good morning, everyone. I'll try that again. Really happy to be here. And I just want to say that Hillary has been an amazing colleague for more than a decade now, I think. I really think that you are very lucky to have Philanthropic Foundations Canada. I've seen a lot of different philanthropy supporting organizations in the US and in Canada. I think this is the absolute best, and the amount of great work that gets done with a very small number of staff and limited resources is really impressive. And she didn't ask me to say this, but if you're not a member yet, you should be a member by the time you leave. So at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, we work with foundations to help them be more effective. That matters because foundations play a unique role in society on a whole range of different issues. And amid the headlines, which are often pretty depressing, the frightening developments globally, and honestly, even just a little bit south of here in American politics, it's important to remember that it is actually, factually, the best time in human history to be a human being on planet Earth. Melinda Gates observed in an interview last month, if you look at the past 15 years, she said, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. More children are living past their 5th birthday, 3.5 million children. In terms of moms dying in childbirth, that number has almost halved in the past 15 years. Huge progress, she said. And you might say, okay, well, wrong messenger, like a billionaire to tell us all that life has never been better. But she's right. She's right. And it's important because it reminds us that progress happens. And it reminds us that foundations have, although there are, I would be the first to agree, too many ineffective foundations, foundations have contributed to significant progress in Canada and in the United States. Foundations have been a force for good. So philanthropy in Canada, foundations have worked to drive down poverty over many decades. Foundations have contributed enormously in Canada to progress on early childhood development, on environmental conservation, and many other issues. In the United States, foundations have contributed, not enough, but many very importantly, to civil rights for people of color and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, to civil rights more recently for gays and lesbians. Foundations have contributed to, finally, some progress and changes in the United States' broken, and I would argue racist, criminal justice system. Change is starting to happen there. And foundations have contributed to change in healthcare access. Whatever flaws the Affordable Care Act has, tens of millions more Americans have access to healthcare. So those are just a few examples of the fact that in this country and in the United States and around the world, foundations have contributed to progress. Now, it's not easy. Your job looks easy from a distance, right? I'm sure you get this. Like working at a foundation, what a cushy gig. Well, not if you want to do it well, right? Not if you want to do it well, and I think you want to do it well. That's why you're here. The board chair at CEP said, very simple observation, hey, this may look easy, but it's not so easy in reality. Grant Oliphant, who's run Heights Endowments and Pittsburgh Community Foundation, if you're going to do it well, it's not so easy. And it matters more and more in Canada as the amount of resources controlled by foundations only increases. So this I just grabbed from the PFC website, and I think the data comes from Imagine Canada and AJA, but look at the growth in foundation assets, some $60 billion. How do you effectively use those resources? When I spoke in Calgary 7 years ago, I said, look, I'm going to talk to you about foundation effectiveness, and you're going to say, geez, that's so simple. It's ridiculous. Why are you here telling us what we already know, that you need clear goals, coherent strategies, disciplined implementation, and relevant performance indicators, that those are the essentials of foundation effectiveness? And the reason that it's not so simple is because each of those things plays out very differently for foundations than they do for business or government. Goals. How do you choose just one or two goals when there are so many interdependent, interconnected, important, pressing challenges? Strategies. Well, in business, you want your strategy to be yours alone. For foundations, if your strategy is yours alone, it will fail. Implementation. How do you implement well when implementation depends on your relationship with others, when you're a step removed often from the issues you seek to affect? Performance assessment, the toughest one of all. There is no analog to ROI or profitability. Assessing foundation performance is super hard. So that's what I talked about in Calgary. I promise I'm not going to talk to you about it again, because I thought about it and I agree with myself. Foundation effectiveness still takes those core elements. It always has, it does today, and it always will. So I want to talk instead about some particular issues of the day, 5 of them, that I think are making your job tougher and raising a lot of vexing questions. And I'm going to draw on an essay that's on our website. So you don't need to like scribble down. I mean, if you were moved to scribble down anything I'm saying, you don't need to. You can get this on our website, and all the questions that I'm going to talk about are listed there. So the big issues, and I think there are 5 of them. You can say, yeah, actually only 3 of them apply to me, or how could you leave these 2 out, or whatever. That's fine. We can debate that. But I want to talk about 5 things. Fundamental questions about the role of philanthropy as the establishment is increasingly under fire. Questioning of the traditional approach to endowment, how you deal with your foundation endowment. An evolving notion of what good strategy and measurement actually look like in philanthropy. The embrace of, or I would argue, return to a recognition that you will get nothing done alone on the most pressing issues, that you need aligned action to make a difference. And finally, a new sophistication in considering how to support nonprofits effectively. So we'll start with the first one. Questions about the legitimacy and role of philanthropy. So if you look at global survey data, charities and the charitable sector in most countries are trusted by the public, more so than business or government. That gap is particularly wide in the United States, which just tells you something about Americans' feelings about business and government. But it exists in other countries as well, and it exists here. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, for example. But do not assume, I would argue it's dangerous to assume that the trust that the public places in operating charities will necessarily be placed in you, representatives of concentrated wealth, big-time donors, big philanthropy. We saw from, 2004, 2005 to maybe 2011 or 2012, what the historian Ben Soskis has called a brief balmy season in which there wasn't much critique of philanthropy. If you read articles about the Gates Foundation, for example, most of them were quite fawning. And Soskis says this is a historical aberration, that over time, certainly in the United States, and I'll be honest with you, I know a little bit less about how this has played out in Canada, but I think it's relevant to you, and I'll explain why. Over time, there has always been questioning about the appropriate influence of concentrated wealth and philanthropy on policy. There's been questions about the legitimacy of foundation influence. And now we're seeing more and more questioning. So you look at the media in the UK, read The Guardian, in the United States, more and more questions about, well, who are you to tell us what the policy should be? Why are we placing so much faith in foundations or major donors? So why is that? I don't really know. I think the increased questioning has something to do with just the erosion of trust in general that we all know about that has taken place over decades in major institutions. The trust we have placed in institutions is eroding. We see that in the UK with the Brexit vote. We see that with Black Lives Matter and a recognition that folks don't necessarily trust the police to have their best interests in mind. We see that RBC excluded in terms of concern about banks, which for decades had been thought of as our corporate citizens. So what does this all mean for you? Well, I think there's opportunity for you to, if you recognize these dynamics and you think about where there is burgeoning activism and concern and how you can align with those concerns and elevate the voices of the disempowered. And I know that that's been a big part of your conversation here, but I think there's also real risk. So yes, foundations are saying we want to do something about inequality, but I wrote an article about something and was talking about, oh, it's great, foundations are wading into this, and a friend of mine tweeted, oh, great, Phil, let's fight plutocracy with plutocracy. I thought that was a fair point. However well-intentioned, major donors can be seen as the embodiment of the establishment. And our research, we surveyed at CEP tens of thousands of grantees of foundations. And we've done some research on how grantees see foundations in terms of their understanding of the perspectives of intended beneficiaries, the people whose lives you're trying to improve, the people who should matter most. And I hate to say it, but grantees see foundations as very out of touch with the views of intended beneficiaries. So as the distance between haves and have-nots have widened, foundations have to redouble their efforts to understand and amplify the voices of the disempowered. That's what the best philanthropy does. So as you've been discussing here in Canada, what can you do on the issue of Indigenous rights? What is your role? How can you amplify voices rather than having undue influence that crowds them out? So I think it raises a lot of questions to consider, and I don't have the answers. How do you ensure your staff and strategies are connected to the people you're trying to help? How do you balance your goals with rising concerns about unelected influence? Are you paying attention to the issues that matter most to the most vulnerable people in society? So that's issue number one. Issue number two is the endowment. Okay, so for a long time, I think the prevalent approach to endowment has been maximize returns, have the foundation exist in perpetuity, and you know what? That happens over there, and the program stuff happens over here, and there's really not a lot of conversation across the divide. I think that's changing. Slowly, but I think it's changing. The rhetoric has changed so far more than the actual reality, but it is changing. So it is true that there's nothing new about foundations spending themselves out of existence. Julius Rosenwald, founder of Sears, famously spent his foundation out in the 20s and 30s. There's nothing new about impact investing. Ford Foundation was doing it in the 60s. There's nothing new about saying we're not going to invest in this area or that area because it conflicts with our values and goals. See, for example, divestment from companies doing business in apartheid South Africa in the 1980s or tobacco companies in the 1990s. And it's true, we did research on this topic, and what we saw at CEP, this was large American foundations, we saw, as I said, the rhetoric is outpacing the action. So only 17% of the foundations we surveyed excluded any industries from their endowment, investment options. 40-some% said they were engaging in impact investing, but the dollars were teeny tiny itty bitty, 0.5% of program, 2% of endowment at the median. And the overwhelming majority said, no, we are managing ourselves to exist in perpetuity. And yet, I think we're on the cusp of something. So how many of you would say your foundations are engaging currently in something you would consider impact investing? And keep your hands up, keep your hands up. And how many are talking about it? Either you're doing it or you're talking about it, thinking about it. Okay, right. So I think it's changing. And I think that's important. We have folks like Clara Miller at the F.B. Heron Foundation, who says, we're all in for impact, every dollar. And she has really chastised her foundation colleagues. She issued a press release and said, you need to jettison your outdated models and recognize that everything you do in terms of the resources you have control over has an impact. You just have to know whether it's positive or negative. But it turns out the knowing part is super hard, right? So I look at a lot of the discussion in the United States, and I see people like Michael Porter at Harvard Business School, who's a big proponent of corporate shared value. And this is sort of the idea that it's like the old SNL skit. If anyone remembers this one, it's a floor wax and a dessert cleaning, dessert topping, floor wax and a dessert topping. So we can make tons of money and make the world better. There are no trade-offs, right? And it's a little bit, in my view, of happy talk, because we see all the time there are trade-offs, right? And you look at Porter and who he highlights as exemplars, Coca-Cola and Nestle. I don't actually think I have to say anything more about that. Okay. So it's really difficult to figure out how, what kind of impact you're really getting. Excluding entire industries, though, that just run counter to your values or your program priorities, much easier to do. And I said before, the majority don't do it of the large foundations we've surveyed. But just yesterday, Brooklyn Community Foundation, small community foundation, announced they're out of a bunch of stuff. They're not going to let their endowment managers invest in for-profit prisons, for example. RBF, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, money comes from fossil fuels. They said, we're out, divest from fossil fuels. California Endowment also said, we're out of for-profit prison. So I think every foundation, I would encourage you, how many of you are board members? Oh, wow. Okay, that's great. So this is stuff that the board, this needs to be front and center in the boardroom. What is the role of the endowment? What is its role? That's a big question. How do you define fiduciary responsibility? Are there certain industries or businesses in which we just won't invest because doing so is counter to the foundation's program goals or its values? Will you seek to actively pursue your programmatic goals through investments of the endowment? And sometimes this is a baked-in thing. You can't discuss it because the donor intent is clear. But if it's not, given what you're trying to do, should you exist in perpetuity? So for example, I'm always struck, and some of these folks are my friends, but by the number of foundations that are working on climate change, and they say climate change is an imminent threat to our ability to live on planet Earth, but we exist in perpetuity. I don't know how much sense that makes. Okay, third issue. An evolving notion of what good strategy and measurement look like in philanthropy. So 6 or 7 years ago, I had lunch with a friend who had helped found an organization in Boston that worked with homeless kids. And he was telling me that he had just been through a lengthy due diligence process with a venture philanthropy organization in which there had been all kinds of requests for data and proposals and revisions of proposals and meetings and conversations and discussions, and they thought they were going to get the big grant, and then they were declined funding. He asked why, and the answer was, your cost per life touched ratio was too high. And he was like, huh, what? And like, who did you compare us to? Were those other organizations also working with homeless kids? The answer was no. Well, homeless kids are much more expensive, right? It's a much more difficult population to reach. He said, I don't know if it's true, but he said, I will give every child in Boston a frickin' lollipop, and my cost per life touched ratio will be really low, but we will have no impact, right? Anyway, and then they didn't talk anymore. That conversation was over. But this is the kind of ridiculous, ludicrous, stupid, idiotic, foolish, moronic, dumbed down measurement, businessification of philanthropy that has done damage. I'm sometimes associated, people think I'm one of those people. I think because I have an MBA, I'm not one of those people. It's a real problem in terms of the way we conceive of performance measurement. Performance measurement is way harder in philanthropy than it is in business. The tools are completely different, and by the way, they're not what you learn in business school. I recognized that like a year into my job, and I hired someone who actually knew what she was doing, right? So think about strategy too. Again, like strategy is really important. You have to have a strategy, but the fundamental difference, as I said before, is that your strategies, if they are just yours, your foundation strategy, will amount to nothing. They have to be shared, they have to be iterative. The cause and effect is much more difficult to understand. So it's just way, 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 way trickier. And I feel like we're starting to recognize this more now. Another thing that's happening is a recognition that if you focus on just one metric, one measure, because you're looking for that analog to ROI or profitability, this is trouble. So this happened in education in the United States. Test scores, test scores, test scores. Everything's about test scores. Well, in retrospect, it's entirely predictable what happened, right? Teaching to the test, widespread cheating scandals in major American cities, city after city after city. You have to have a range of measures. You cannot put all your eggs in one measurement basket, and you will not have definitive proof. You're looking for, Jim Collins says, it's less like the criminal standard in a criminal trial of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and more like a preponderance of the evidence, which is in the United States what it takes for in a civil case. Right? You're never going to, you can't know the counterfactual. Measurement is super difficult. But it's really important, and you have to share what you're learning. And we did and not only that, you have to support nonprofits to collect the data, right? So we did a study on nonprofits on our website, nonprofits and the support that they're getting, not getting from foundations for their assessment efforts. 2/3 get no help whatsoever from any of their funders, they say, financial or non-financial, in terms of performance measurement. 2/3. 2/3 of foundations say they help their grantees with performance measurement. So, and how are they going to do this work? I mean, the grantees that we survey, median budget, and these are grantees of larger foundations, median budget is $1.5 million. So stop the unfunded mandates. If you want certain data to inform your sense of how things are going, pay for it and talk to the nonprofits about what they need. Talk to the nonprofits about what they need to get better, because that should be the most important question. What do they need to get better? Boards need to embrace the complexity of measurement. So we did a benchmarking study of foundation boards. And actually the good news there is boards are overwhelmingly spending their time on questions of strategy and impact assessment. And I think to a greater extent than was true a decade ago. You have to recognize, though, that it's so much harder. So lots of questions. What do you hold yourselves accountable for? And how will you judge performance? What data can inform that judgment? How do you gather it? Are you supporting nonprofits to collect the data they need, as I just discussed? And how are you getting candid comparative feedback to ensure you don't live in a bubble of positivity? Because I'm just here to tell you, just to make myself real popular, you live in a bubble of positivity. You are surrounded by people who are predisposed to tell you what they think you want to hear. I think you know that, right? And so you have to reach out and figure out how do we burst that bubble? And I'll come back to that. Okay, fourth one. Just the recognition, and you guys get this, and I'll get to this. You guys get this, I think, to a greater degree than your colleagues south of the border. Working in concert with others, this is not a new idea, right? Of course, if you're working on the toughest problems, you're not going to get it done alone. Look at the work that was done on the tuberculosis epidemic a century ago, and foundations and government actors and nonprofits and companies like Metropolitan Life Insurance coming together to do something about that. Look at issues like climate change. Well, of course you're not going to do anything on climate change that's meaningful by yourself. 16 major billion-dollar-plus foundations have come together to work in a coordinated way on that issue. Marriage equality, a great case example. Go to the Haas Jr. website and read about the case study of the foundations that came together, $153 million, pooled the resources, shared strategy to change things in the United States and start to have a little bit more of the kind of environment of equal opportunity and civil rights for everyone that Canadians, I think, probably can't believe that Americans took them so long to get there. So you got to put egos aside. You got to recognize that sometimes what you need is to follow, not to lead. And you got to share what you're learning. We did a study on transparency, and it was really interesting. Like, what kind of information do people really want, funders and grantees? And when people talk about transparency, they're like, oh, well, we have our board members listed on our website, or we have our charter document. Nobody cares about your charter documents. They care the information that funders want from other funders and that grantees want from funders. It's all the same. Everybody wants the same thing. It is what's working, what's not working, so that we don't do it and make the same mistake you did, and how are you assessing yourself? What are you learning through assessment? So those are the things that people want. So I think we can't all look good all the time. We can't all punch above our weight. We can't all be the ones creating leverage. Sometimes we got to get on board, put the egos aside, and just follow other people who are really smart and know what they're doing. And as I said, I think you guys actually get this. So I've been so impressed by all the examples. The Declaration of Action on Reconciliation, the Cities for People initiative, the Winnipeg Boldness Initiative. Just read the Foundation House case study, the Counseling Foundation of Canada, Laidlaw, and Lawson coming together to share space, but it goes way beyond that in terms of really trying to collaborate. So, are your strategies shared by other funders and other grantees and relevant players? Are they? If they're not, they're going to fail. When should you just follow? What are you sharing about what you're learning about what is and isn't working? How can you learn from and work with other foundations toward the achievement of shared goals? Okay, final one, and I'm really passionate about this one. How do you support nonprofits effectively? I am so tired of the analogies. Grantees are our customers. They're not your customers. They're not your customers. The money's flowing in the opposite direction, right? And I went to dinner a number of years ago with my wife and kids, and we splurged on like a place that didn't usually, our kids were younger, we don't usually go to a place like that with our kids. But we thought, I don't know, we're celebrating something, whatever. We're there, it's this like really fancy kind of hoity-toity place in Harvard Square in Cambridge. And my daughter, who was 11 at the time, whispers, "Mom, there are mice." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" She was mice everywhere, under the table. You know, everyone's oblivious. Everyone's, you know, very fancy restaurant, mice everywhere. You know, 8-year-old freaks out. It's a whole scene. We leave, and and then eventually we laugh. You know, at some point we laugh. We're at home. And I go on every site I can, you know, TripAdvisor, Yelp, whatever. I trash the place. There were mice everywhere. Because I don't ever have to eat there again, right? The dynamics are, I can slam that joint. The dynamics are totally different between funders and grantees. So that's just one example. They are not your customer. Another one, there are contractors, you know, kind of like the guy who comes to fix your sink. Well, you know, sometimes if you're funding like a department in a university to do a research project, you don't really, your strategy is not really aligned with the university, you just need that research done. Okay, sometimes that analogy kind of works. But there's got to be a significant number of organizations that need to be strong as organizations for you to be successful. And then you have to fund them in a way that helps them become strong as organizations, not just to do the little itty-bitty piece of work that you want done. And then I think the most damaging of all, and I fear I'll offend people, but is there are investees. We're investing. Well, first of all, most of your grants are a pretty small percentage of the organization's budget. And secondly, and most importantly, you don't own them. You don't own them. So it's just the wrong dynamic, I think. So I would suggest that your grantees are your grantees, and the analog for the relationship between foundations and grantees is the relationship between foundations and grantees, and seek to understand it and get really good at it. So we see some recognition of this. So there is more interest, allow the brief commercial interruption, more interest in tools like our Grantee Perception Report, which some 300 funders have used, including some Canadian foundations, to get comparative, candid feedback, because there's no way to get it if you just ask them, and it's not that expensive. Anyway, so talk to me. But also more interest in our research on, for example, the relationship between program officers and grantees, the degree of variation that often exists among program officers at the very same foundation. There's also more interest in supporting organizations. So there's been an effort to try to say, look, we need to provide more unrestricted support to the organizations. So I would ask you, what proportion of your grantees are general operating support recipients, and why isn't it higher? Which ones are really essential organizations in pursuit of your shared strategy, and why aren't you funding them to get better as organizations? And then there's also the question of when you have to give program support, are you providing enough support for overhead? So there's been a whole campaign on this in the United States about the overhead myth. And the realization that an administrative cost ratio is not a proxy for impact. The percentage that a nonprofit spends on program versus non-program and all these kind of arbitrary and often fudged distinctions is not the right way to measure. Look at the overall budget of the organization relative to what it's achieving, and let the executive director, who hopefully you trust, worry about how to allocate that budget. So if you're going to support organizations, really support them. Hillary wrote in one of her blog posts, most foundations know that the operational and strategic capacity of their grantees is the key success factor in whether their funds are going to be used for maximum impact. They know it, but then she went on to say, it's easier said than done to provide effective support for capacity. So you have to get good at this, as hard as it is. So again, I think there are really good examples in Canada. The Max Bell Foundation Public Training Institute, in a weave, supported by the McConnell Foundation. As you do this work, be careful about easy answers, right? What's right for you to do might be different than another funder. So there tends to be this assumption like, we will help them get better because we have the skills to strengthen their capacity. Ask your grantees first, what do they need? What are they getting from other funders? And then figure out how you fit in. So which are the organizations you see as vital to your strategies? And how are you supporting them to be stronger? Are you sufficiently staffed and resourced to do that work well? Lean is not always better. Does the organization create incentives for underinvestment in capacity through an overemphasis on overhead? What proportion of your grants are large, unrestricted, and multi-year? And why aren't there more? So I would suggest to you, and maybe you feel this way already, that your job is actually really hard if you're going to do it well. That it's way less straightforward than leading a business or even an operating nonprofit. That it's a unique privilege, definitely. And private foundations are immune from a lot of worries that the rest of us have. You know, you have an endowment. You don't wake up in the middle of the night worrying about whether you're going to hit payroll the way Hillary and I do. You don't. But with that responsibility, you wake up in the middle of the night thinking, holy smokes, are we having the impact that we could? Because we do have such an opportunity. We're in a privileged position. So remember, institutional philanthropy matters. Even as we so often lament all that used to be better, or all that feels wrong, the facts and the data tell us something different. It is, as I said at the beginning, the best time in human history to be alive on planet Earth, and philanthropy has helped make that so. And it can help make it more so in 10 years and in 100 years. So the work you do matters, and I thank you for doing it thoughtfully and well. Thanks.